"You're done here," he said, and that's when the clock started. I was escorted out like I'd stolen something, not like I'd built what kept the company alive. No warning, no discussion, just a signature and a smile from someone who didn't bother to learn my name. What he didn't know was that firing me didn't end my role. It triggered it. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they're already moving before anyone notices. If you've ever been pushed aside by someone who thought you were replaceable, stay with me, because what happened next forced an entire company to learn a lesson they couldn't undo. Watch closely and tell me in the comments if you'd have done the same. Before the meeting invite hit my calendar, my work was already moving through the building without me attached to it. That morning, operations forwarded a routing exception report I'd built months earlier, and within an hour, dispatch rerouted 3 delayed shipments without escalating anything to leadership. An automated billing reconciliation I designed flagged duplicate invoices, finance corrected them, and a client escalation died quietly before it reached sales. None of that required approval. It ran because it was wired that way. When I walked into the conference room later, a printed agenda waited at each seat, and my name was missing from the presenter list, even though 2 of the items depended on systems I controlled. The meeting ended with a decision to simplify ownership, and by the time people stood up, the decision had already been implemented in a shared folder. Access trimmed, reporting reassigned, my dashboards relabeled as legacy. After lunch, an email went out company-wide announcing a cost review. Within minutes, managers replied, all with compliance language, and a follow-up asked for documentation on replaceable functions. I forwarded the request to legal with my notes attached and copied operations. Legal replied asking for the contract appendix. Operations replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Silence from leadership followed, the kind that lands after a decision is made elsewhere. Later, IT disabled a service account tied to a staging environment, and an alert pinged my phone because it broke a nightly reconciliation. I restored it, documented the dependency, and sent a single message to the thread explaining the consequence if it happened again. No response came back, but the account stayed enabled. Before I left, procurement stopped by to ask why a vendor couldn't finalize a renewal without my sign-off. I handed them the clause they needed and watched them nod as they took a photo of the page. When I stepped into the elevator, the building kept running, invoices clearing, routes updating, alerts quiet. The motion wasn't loyalty or habit, it was design. And design doesn't argue when someone above it decides to cut without checking what's connected. When I walked into the room, security was already there, standing too close to the wall to be accidental. Grant sat at the head of the table with a folder open, my name printed on the tab like it had been waiting. He didn't ask me to sit. He didn't ask how my week was. He started by sliding a single page across the table and saying the word effective like it was a favor. The document listed performance misalignment, operational redundancy, and future direction, none of which referenced a single system, process, or metric. I asked which projects were being reassigned, and he said they were consolidating ownership. I asked who would be responsible for the routing engine during peak load, and he said the team would figure it out. He nodded to security before I finished the sentence. The room stayed quiet, not awkward quiet, but procedural quiet, the kind that happens when everyone has already been briefed. I stood, gathered the folder without opening it, and asked for confirmation in writing that my access would remain active until transition was complete. Grant said access would end today. The guard stepped closer. I walked out without raising my voice because there was nothing left to negotiate. At my desk, IT waited while I logged out. An email landed in my inbox announcing leadership alignment and thanking me for my contributions. The message went company-wide before I reached the elevator. Operations pinged me asking why their dashboard stopped updating. Finance asked why invoices stalled mid-cycle. I didn't answer either. At the lobby desk, HR slid a packet across and pointed to the signature tabs. I signed where indicated, declined the exit interview, and asked for a copy of the termination notice. HR said it would be emailed. In the parking lot, my phone lit up with missed calls from managers who hadn't been in the room. I returned none of them. Instead, I forwarded the termination email to my attorney with a single line. "Please confirm activation." She replied with a request for confirmation of separation status. I sent back a photo of the badge on my passenger seat. Before I started the engine, procurement called asking whether a vendor could proceed without my approval. I said they should read the contract and decide accordingly. The call ended without an argument. By the time I pulled onto the road, my attorney confirmed the trigger condition and asked if I wanted notices prepared. I said yes, today. Back at the building, access removals rippled through the systems that shared credentials, and alerts began stacking up in queues no one else monitored. A senior manager emailed Grant asking why nightly reconciliations failed. Grant replied, "All that the issue was under review." Another email followed, asking why a client's shipments were frozen at 3 hubs. The answer didn't come. I reached home before sunset and placed the signed packet on the table, unopened. My attorney sent drafts within the hour. I approved them without edits. When the notices went out, they weren't angry or dramatic. They were precise. And precision doesn't give anyone room to pretend they didn't understand what was about to happen. When the notices were delivered, they landed quietly, the way serious documents always do. No one announced them in a meeting, no alarms sounded. Legal received them first, then operations, then finance, each addressed by name and role, each outlining the same condition and the same deadline. The first reaction came from operations, not leadership. A manager emailed asking whether the notice applied to the routing optimizer or just the billing layer. Legal replied that it applied to every license component listed in the appendix. The manager forwarded that reply to a distribution list that included people who had never seen the appendix before. Within an hour, a second message followed, asking where the appendix could be found. Legal attached it. Silence came next, the kind that spreads when people start reading instead of talking. Before the afternoon planning call, dashboards began showing warnings instead of confirmations. The system didn't fail, it restricted. Test environments locked first, then integrations flagged non-compliance, then automated approvals stopped issuing tokens. A regional director tried to bypass the restriction by copying credentials from an archived document. The attempt was logged, rejected, and reported to compliance. That report went to a mailbox Grant monitored. He didn't reply. Before the end of the day, Finance sent a note asking whether a temporary waiver could be issued to close invoices already in progress. Legal answered that no waivers were permitted without a new agreement. The word temporary disappeared from the thread. The next morning, a standing meeting went forward without me. I know because a calendar invite was forwarded asking whether I could clarify a dependency. I didn't respond. Instead, my attorney forwarded a status update confirming receipt by all parties and reminding them of the date when usage must cease. Operations replied, asking whether maintenance patches were included. Legal confirmed they were. That confirmation moved quickly, copied to senior leadership. Before lunch, a client escalation reached the executive queue when shipments at 2 hubs failed to reconcile against billing records. The proposed fix suggested rolling back to a previous configuration. IT replied that rollback required access that had been revoked. The message thread stalled. Later, a director attempted to commission an external consultant. Procurement replied that onboarding would take weeks and access would still be restricted. The consultant request died in procurement's queue. When a town hall was announced for the afternoon, it opened with assurances about continuity and closed with no questions taken. After the call, managers sent private messages asking whether anything could be done to keep systems stable through the end of the quarter. Legal replied with a copy of the notice and no commentary. Before the second planning cycle, a competitor announcement crossed internal chat channels, not as a press release, but as a screenshot from a partner who had been briefed. It mentioned accelerated timelines and readiness for immediate onboarding. That screenshot reached sales first. Sales forwarded it to leadership with a single question mark. Leadership didn't answer. Instead, Grant emailed legal asking whether the notices could be retracted if discussions resumed. Legal replied that retraction required consent from both parties and a new agreement. The phrase, "new agreement," changed the tone of the replies that followed. By the time an emergency meeting was scheduled, managers had already adjusted their language, switching from assumptions to requests. The meeting ended with an action item to explore options. Options arrived as emails asking whether I would be open to a call. I didn't reply. My attorney did, acknowledging receipt and directing further communication through her office. That response triggered a flurry of calendar updates and a revised agenda for the next day. Meanwhile, the systems continued to do exactly what they were designed to do: enforce terms, restrict use, and report attempts to bypass them. Each action produced a record. Each record removed another excuse. Before the next meeting began, a senior executive asked operations to provide a list of dependencies. Operations sent a spreadsheet that ran longer than the screen. The executive replied, asking which items were critical. Operations replied, all of them. The room went quiet again, not because anyone felt embarrassed, but because the sequence was now visible. Notices sent, access restricted, work stopped, and no one in charge could say they hadn't been told what would happen next. Before the emergency meeting invitation reached my inbox, my attorney had already received 3 calls asking whether there was room to clarify intent. She logged each one, returned none immediately, and forwarded me a summary that listed the callers by title rather than name. During the meeting, leadership spoke about continuity, while operation screens showed growing backlogs. When a manager suggested prioritizing high-value clients, finance replied that invoices couldn't be finalized without compliant routing confirmations. That response ended the discussion and moved the agenda forward without resolution. After the meeting, a revised org chart circulated that reassigned my former responsibilities to 2 directors and a consultant line item. The consultant request bounced back from procurement with a note about access restrictions and onboarding timelines. No one challenged it. When the follow-up email went out asking for stopgap approvals, legal replied that approvals constituted continued use. The email chain ended there. Before the next planning cycle, my attorney sent a formal acknowledgement reiterating the deadline and attaching a summary of non-compliant activity already logged. The summary listed attempts, outcomes, and references to the same appendix everyone was now reading. That document moved quickly through leadership channels and returned with a question about interim licensing. My attorney replied with a rate card and terms. Silence followed. When sales requested an exception for a flagship account, operations answered that exceptions required changes that violated the notice. Sales escalated to leadership. Leadership asked legal. Legal copied my attorney. The loop closed without action. Before lunch, a director sent me a message asking if I would consider a brief call to clear up confusion. I didn't answer. My attorney responded instead, confirming availability for formal discussions and attaching the same terms. The reply came back asking whether the rate was flexible. The answer was no. That afternoon, a town hall was held with cameras on and questions filtered. Continuity was promised again. After the call, internal chat filled with screenshots of stalled queues and customer emails asking for explanations. Managers replied with holding statements drafted by communications. The statements used words like temporary and isolated. Operations didn't echo those words. They sent screenshots. Before the end of the day, leadership attempted a reset by announcing a task force. The task force requested documentation. Operations sent links. Legal sent reminders. The task force requested access. IT replied that access required authorization that no longer existed. The request closed unresolved. The next morning, my attorney forwarded a voicemail transcription from Grant, asking whether I understood the broader impact. She replied that impact was outlined in the notice. He asked for a meeting. She offered dates with conditions. He didn't accept them. Instead, an updated offer arrived proposing a short-term bridge. The offer included a number that assumed urgency on my side. My attorney replied with the same rate card and a shorter deadline. That response changed the tone of subsequent emails, shifting from proposals to appeals. One message asked whether I would consider the employees affected. My attorney replied that considerations were addressed in the contract. Another asked whether a rehire would void the notice. The answer was no. Before the second emergency meeting, operations circulated a report showing that reroutes created downstream billing mismatches that compounded each cycle. Finance replied that mismatches prevented close. Leadership asked for estimates. Operations replied with ranges that grew each hour. During the meeting, someone suggested rolling back to a previous quarter's configuration. It replied that the rollback required components covered by the notice. The suggestion was withdrawn. After the meeting, a senior executive emailed my attorney asking for a call off the record. She declined and reiterated the formal channel. By the time the afternoon ended, leadership circulated a message asking teams to document workarounds. Operations replied that workarounds required permissions they didn't have. The message thread stopped. I didn't need updates to know what was happening. The sequence was consistent. Attempts to negotiate through urgency failed. Attempts to reassign responsibility failed. Attempts to bypass controls failed and produced records. Each action created a response, and each response narrowed the options. Before the day closed, my attorney sent one final note confirming receipt of inquiries and restating the deadline. The language was neutral, almost generous. It didn't threaten anything. It didn't need to. The systems were already answering for me. Before the next internal meeting could happen on their side, my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't saved. I didn't answer. Minutes later, an email arrived asking for availability to discuss external options. I forwarded it to my attorney without comment. She replied to the sender with a single question about scope. The response came back broader than expected, mentioning timelines, client retention, and competitive exposure. That was enough. I sent one message of my own, not to leadership, but to a contact I'd kept professional and distant for years, asking if she had time to talk. The reply came back with a location and a window. When I walked into the room, the agenda was already printed, and unlike the last meeting, my name was centered at the top. We didn't start with pleasantries. She asked what was active, what was restricted, and what could move quickly. I answered in sequences, not explanations, listing dependencies and outcomes. She took notes, then pushed a folder across the table with a draft timeline that ended before my former company's deadline. No one raised their voice. No one asked me to justify anything. When the discussion turned to terms, she didn't open with urgency. She opened with alignment. Her team outlined resources they had ready, clients already asking questions, and a launch window that matched the gaps appearing elsewhere. I asked how they planned to staff it. She said they'd been waiting for the right moment to accelerate. We agreed to keep the conversation contained. When I left the room, a calendar invite followed immediately for a technical review and a separate one for legal. Before that review, my attorney received a request from my former company asking whether I was engaged in discussions with competitors. She replied that I was free to do so and attached the ruling they had already acknowledged. The reply didn't come back. During the review, engineers asked specific questions about handoffs and timelines. I answered them with diagrams, not stories. When someone suggested a shortcut, I said no and explained the consequence. They accepted it and adjusted the plan. After the review, legal joined and asked for confirmation that there were no conflicting obligations. My attorney provided it. Terms were discussed and revised in real time, not negotiated through silence. When the draft agreement circulated, it included a start date that overlapped with the remaining notice period elsewhere. We adjusted it forward by a week and moved on. Before the next meeting at my former company, news of a competitive briefing reached their sales team through a partner who had been invited. Sales forwarded the note internally asking whether it was accurate. Leadership replied that discussions were ongoing. Operations didn't comment. Before lunch, my attorney forwarded a new message from Grant requesting a call as soon as possible. She replied with availability after the competitor meeting concluded. Grant didn't confirm. Instead, a revised offer arrived, increasing the number and shortening the term. My attorney replied that urgency didn't change valuation. That reply triggered a series of messages escalating titles and widening CC lists. Each response added another person who hadn't read the appendix yet. On the competitor side, a status update went out confirming readiness to announce once documentation was finalized. Communications drafted language that focused on stability and continuity. No one mentioned my former employer by name. When I stepped into the legal call, the focus was on risk management and timing. Questions were answered, conditions were met, signatures were queued. Before the call ended, a message arrived from my attorney with a forwarded voicemail transcription. Grant was asking whether I understood the damage this could cause. I didn't respond. My attorney replied that all communication should remain formal. The next update from the competitor confirmed that onboarding tasks were complete and client outreach would begin after announcement. That announcement landed internally at my former company as a forwarded screenshot, not a memo. Managers asked leadership what it meant. Leadership replied that they were evaluating options. Before the day ended, my attorney sent me confirmation that agreements were ready pending final approval. I approved them. The sequence was set. One side was still asking questions. The other had moved on to execution. Before the boardroom doors closed, I could already tell this meeting was different by who was waiting inside. Grant stood instead of sitting, his phone face down on the table like it might betray him if it lit up. Two executives who hadn't spoken to me in years avoided eye contact, shuffling papers they didn't need. When I took my seat, no one asked why I was there. The agenda didn't include my name, but the first item depended on it. Grant started with a summary about operational strain and client pressure, using phrases that softened responsibility without removing it. Halfway through, a board member interrupted and asked a direct question about the notices and the deadline. Legal answered before Grant could, confirming the date and the restrictions. The room shifted. Grant tried to regain control by reframing the issue as a misunderstanding, then turned to me and asked if I would explain my position. I didn't explain. I confirmed facts. I stated the terms, the timeline, and the consequence of continued use. A director asked whether an exception could be made for a single client. I said exceptions weren't part of the agreement. Grant cut in and said this was unreasonable, that people were confused, that teams were hurting. A board member asked why the contracts were written that way. Grant said they predated his role. Legal corrected him and said they'd been reviewed annually. Silence followed. When Grant tried again, this time appealing to collaboration, a board member asked why the risk hadn't been identified during the cost review. Grant said the review focused on headcount. The board member asked who signed off on removing the owner of licensed systems without a transition. Grant didn't answer. The question hung there until legal spoke again, confirming the separation date and the trigger condition. At that point, Grant's posture changed. He sat down, leaned forward, and addressed me directly, asking whether there was any scenario where I would reconsider. I said discussions would remain formal and referred him to my attorney. He pressed, saying this didn't need to become adversarial. A director responded that it already was. When the board asked for options, operations presented a slide showing backlog growth and client escalations. Finance followed with projections that assumed no resolution. The numbers didn't argue, they accumulated. Grant attempted to close the meeting by proposing a task force. A board member said a task force wouldn't restore access. Another asked whether leadership had a path forward. No one answered. Grant then suggested a private conversation. I declined. The board chair asked Grant to step out. He hesitated, then left the room. The door closed and the room exhaled. The board chair asked legal to summarize the exposure. Legal did. The summary was brief. A director asked me whether I was prepared to move forward elsewhere. I said agreements were already in place. That admission changed the temperature. The board chair thanked me for clarity and said the board would deliberate. When Grant returned, the chair informed him that negotiations would proceed through council and that leadership decisions would be reviewed. Grant objected, raising his voice for the first time. The chair cut him off and asked him to sit. He did. The meeting ended without a vote, but the outcome was visible in the way people avoided Grant's eyes as they stood. In the hallway, he tried to speak to me again, lowering his voice, asking whether I understood what this would mean for him. I didn't stop walking. My attorney joined me at the elevator and confirmed that the board had requested updated terms directly. Behind us, Grant remained in the hallway, holding a phone that never rang. When the elevator doors closed, the building behind me kept humming, but the authority inside it had shifted. The humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was procedural, documented, and witnessed by the people who mattered. Before the announcement went public, the effects were already visible inside the company in small, undeniable ways. Managers stopped sending optimistic updates and started forwarding client emails without commentary. When I opened my inbox that morning, my attorney had sent a brief note confirming that the board had requested revised terms and that leadership changes were under discussion. No adjectives, no predictions, just facts. Before the next internal call on their side, sales circulated a list of accounts at risk. Operations replied with a separate list of dependencies tied to those accounts. The lists overlapped almost completely. When finance added projected revenue impact, the thread grew quiet. By the time leadership joined the call, the numbers were already fixed on the screen. There was talk of stabilization plans and phased responses, but each proposal ended the same way, with someone asking who would authorize access or approve changes. No one answered. After the call, a director sent a message asking whether temporary permissions could be granted for damage control. Legal replied that permissions would constitute continued use. The request ended there. Before lunch, a notice went out announcing an emergency board session. The wording avoided names, but the timing said enough. Internally, calendars shifted and meetings disappeared. Externally, clients began asking direct questions. Communications drafted responses that emphasized investigation and commitment. Operations didn't distribute them. Instead, they sent status reports showing stalled processes and escalating queues. When a major client requested a call with executive leadership, the meeting was scheduled and then postponed. The client followed up with a deadline of their own. That deadline passed without resolution. Before the end of the day, the first resignation notice circulated, quietly forwarded without commentary. The next morning, another followed. The pattern repeated, senior titles first, then managers whose teams had absorbed the pressure. When leadership attempted to regain control by announcing interim oversight, the announcement prompted questions about authority. Legal replied that oversight didn't change the terms already in force. The clarification spread faster than the announcement. Before the next cycle of meetings, a competitor press briefing leaked, not through official channels but through a screenshot shared by a partner. Sales forwarded it again, asking whether the timeline was accurate. Leadership replied that they were aware. Operations didn't reply at all. When the board reconvened, the agenda skipped forward to restructuring options. A director asked whether the cost of rebuilding internally had been estimated. Operations replied with timelines that extended beyond existing client commitments. Finance added that reserves wouldn't cover the gap. The discussion moved to divestment. That word landed heavier than any accusation. Before the meeting ended, legal confirmed that continued delays increased exposure. The chair asked for recommendations. Names were mentioned. Grants was among them. When the meeting adjourned, internal chat went silent for the first time since the notices had gone out. No jokes, no side conversations. Just read receipts. By the afternoon, the announcement landed. Leadership changes effective immediately, a review of strategic direction, and a commitment to transparency. It didn't mention why. It didn't need to. Clients had already begun to leave, notifying account managers that they were exercising termination clauses. Each notice triggered another internal alert, another recalculation. When I received the update from my attorney confirming the changes, I forwarded it to my calendar and accepted the next onboarding meeting elsewhere. Before the day closed, a former colleague reached out asking if this was how it ended. I replied that endings don't arrive all at once. They arrive as consequences. When I shut my laptop, the company I'd left was still operating in name, but the structure that held it together had given way. Decisions no longer produced movement. Authority no longer produced results. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, contractual, and irreversible. Before my first official meeting at the new company, I cleared my calendar and closed every thread tied to the last 30 days. My attorney sent a final confirmation that the transition was complete and that no further action was required unless contacted through counsel. I acknowledged it and archived the message. When I walked into the new office, the agenda was practical. Onboarding tasks, ownership boundaries, and a review schedule that matched real dependencies. Decisions were made in the room and recorded before anyone stood up. After the meeting, operations sent a checklist and asked for confirmation. I confirmed. The systems came online in sequence and the first test run closed cleanly. That afternoon, communications shared a draft announcement and asked whether any language created obligations beyond what we'd agreed. Legal cleared it. The announcement went out without drama. On the other side, news traveled differently. Former colleagues forwarded headlines without commentary. Clients I hadn't spoken to in years sent short notes acknowledging the change. One asked whether stability would return soon. I replied that stability depends on alignment, not reassurance. Before the week ended, my calendar filled with reviews that focused on execution rather than justification. Engineers brought problems and left with decisions. Finance closed cycles without exceptions. Sales aligned commitments with capacity instead of promises. Each action produced a result that didn't need explaining. When a former executive requested a call through a mutual contact, I declined and asked that any communication go through counsel. The contact replied that they understood. The message stopped there. Before the next board meeting at my new firm, a brief update circulated summarizing progress against milestones. The tone was factual. No one asked who deserved credit. When the meeting began, the chair asked whether risks were understood. I answered with controls, not assurances. The chair nodded and moved on. Outside of work, the changes were quieter. I stopped checking alerts that no longer applied. I returned equipment that wasn't mine to keep. I organized documents that had been assembled for defense and repurposed them for reference. When someone asked whether the outcome felt satisfying, I said satisfaction wasn't the point. Consistency was. Before the final deadline from my former company passed, my attorney forwarded a short note confirming compliance. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to add. The company continued under new leadership, smaller and constrained, issuing updates that promised rebuilding. I didn't track them. My attention moved to the next review, the next decision, the next consequence tied to action. In conversations with new hires, I didn't tell stories. I showed them where terms lived, who owned what, and how to ask for clarity before it was needed. When someone proposed a shortcut, I asked for the downstream effect. They revised the plan. The work improved. Before my first quarterly review, results were circulated that spoke for themselves. No one needed a narrative to understand them. At the end of the day, I left the office when the work was done. The outcome didn't feel like revenge. It felt like alignment restored after it had been ignored. The lesson wasn't dramatic or inspirational. It was operational. Know what you control. Put it in writing. Act when conditions are met. Let systems enforce what people pretend they didn't hear. And when the noise fades, keep building things that don't depend on permission to work. What stayed with me wasn't the meeting where my name disappeared from the agenda, or the email that went out before I reached the elevator. It was how quiet strength looks when it finally has to speak. I didn't raise my voice in that room. I didn't argue when security stood too close. I let the documents do the talking because they were written long before anyone decided I was expendable. That's the part people miss. Power doesn't always show up as authority. Sometimes it sits in a folder waiting for the moment when denial turns into consequences. When the email started looping and the silence stretched, I learned how fragile confidence is when it isn't backed by preparation. Though, humiliation wasn't watching someone stumble. It was watching leaders realize in real time that they never understood what kept things running. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, prepared. The strength came from years of doing unglamorous work, documenting decisions, saving approvals, insisting on clear terms even when it slowed things down. When the calls came asking for exceptions, I didn't feel tempted. I felt finished. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about self-respect expressed through structure. If I'd relied on goodwill, I would have been erased. Because I relied on records the truth held. If you're still working in a place where decisions happen behind closed doors, don't assume fairness will save you. Build quiet defenses, keep receipts, know exactly what you own. When the moment arrives, and it will, you won't need to explain yourself. The paper will. How to get started today. Save every approval and decision tied to your work. Read your contracts like someone else's future depends on them. Stop relying on verbal promises. Get it written. Know what breaks if you're removed. Prepare calmly, even when things seem fine. If you've ever protected yourself quietly at work, share how you did it. Someone reading might need that example right now.